Well, good afternoon. What I want to do today is talk to you a little bit about the unit that we're beginning and talk a little bit about Gothic literature. So I'm going to take you through the PowerPoint that you actually have already loaded up in D2L, but I want to kind of talk you through it. So one of the questions we're going to be asking ourselves is, why is it that ghost stories and I guess I could say stories about monsters generally, but for us, particularly ghost stories, why do they continue to resonate for us? Why do they continue to be so interesting to us and so important to us? So you have some links to look at this week. I put up a link to the Wikipedia article about ghosts and just defining what ghosts are. One of the things that you'll find from reading that article is how very prevalent a belief in ghosts is, which seems crazy even on into the 21st century, but also just how many cultures have some notion of a ghost, an apparition or a spirit that returns from the dead and that haunts somebody. That notion of haunting is very much a part of beliefs all across countries, cultures, and across the centuries as well. So it's very much a kind of human concern or a human preoccupation. And then, of course, you have an article asking the very question, why do we believe in ghosts? What do we think about that? What is venturing some ideas about what it is about ghosts that continue to kind of fascinate us? But I'm introducing to you this notion of Gothic literature. In part, of course, the two stories that you'll read next week fall into the category of Gothic literature because they are ghost stories, and also because later when we read Beloved, I want you to be able to sort of note the Gothic qualities that you'll see in that novel. So let's talk about Gothic literature. So where did it come from? And we see the first Gothic literature really in the late 18th century, right? So the late 1700s. I'm going to tilt this up just a little bit. Okay, from the late 1700s. And the name comes from the Gothic architecture of the Middle Ages, in part because the stories themselves, like Gothic literature, the stories are so complex and so complicated and have so much, kind of detail, but also because they're often set in the Middle Ages, and they are often set in buildings that are ruined or that are abandoned, castles and ruined houses or very isolated places. And so there's something about the spirit of Gothic literature, the gargoyles and the enormously heavy stone buildings and the very sort of heavily ornamented style that are sort of reminiscent of this kind of literature. Gothic cathedrals, as you can see, are intended to inspire, but they also have these kind of gargoyle characters all the way, periodically. There are these on the outside of Gothic cathedrals like Notre Dame. You see these kind of scary looking monstrous characters that also kind of are intended to ward off evil, if you will. And there's an example, if you can, I hope that's translating, but if you can't see it very well on here, you can look in the PowerPoint that you have in D2L. But this is some example of the gargoyle. And so you think about the gargoyle, and it's this kind of monstrous, kind of scary creature that's intended to ward off evil, but it's also placed on a Catholic cathedral. So you see this kind of intersection of superstition and religion that you often see in Gothic literature. All right, so it's an offshoot of the Romantic literature, right? And the predecessor for modern horror stories. And so it takes the notion, the Romantic idea. You've read poets like Wordsworth and Keats and other poets during that period who were kind of nature worshipers. They saw nature as consoling. They saw nature as a place to learn more about yourself, understand yourself, and also they saw nature as a kind of teacher, if you will. And the Gothic writers take that and they make nature equally powerful, but now it becomes destructive. And so nature becomes a source of danger and anxiety and fear. So, for example, Frankenstein is all about this experiment, this natural experiment gone wrong and creating a monster. But throughout that novel, you see catastrophic storms and rain and drownings and so on, ice storms. And so, it's nature kind of at its worst, which we know a little bit about right now, don't we? The imagination becomes a very important part of this kind of literature. Think about how Gothic literature, how horror literature sort of takes your imagination and uses it against you, right? So you imagine the monster, you imagine, this creepy character stalking you or finding you. You imagine the monster in your closet or under your bed. That notion of suspense is very much a part of this kind of literature. Very much a part of what makes it frightening. So imagination is an important part of this kind of literature. Whereas for the Romantics, when they looked at the individual and they looked at imagination, they saw it as something, with potential, sort of optimistic potential. For the Gothic writer, the imagination is a dark place. It's imagining what's hiding in the shadows, or what is the potential of evil in the individual. And that's how they viewed the imagination. So, some familiar names that you're going to recognize, obviously, Edgar Allan Poe. We all read Edgar Allan Poe growing up, and he's really the American master of the Gothic tradition. We also, most of us probably read Nathaniel Hawthorne, The Minister's Black Veil, Young Goodman Brown, short stories like that, very much in the Gothic tradition. All right, some characteristics of Gothic literature. It's often, but not always, set in the medieval period. The tone of it is dark, it's mysterious, right? There are things that go bump in the night, if you will. Often set in haunted places, isolated places, old houses, castles, etc. There is a sense of foreboding and a sense of evil in a Gothic story. Very often there are supernatural elements, ghosts, other spirits, vampires, other kind of monsters, mysterious and secret appearances and disappearances to build suspense, and often supernatural or paranormal occurrences. So think about hauntings in that way, haunted houses, haunted places. Often spirituality or religion is not always, but often is a part of Gothic literature. So very often there are characters who are priests or monks or friars. Sometimes things happen in churches or cathedrals. There's often a Gothic double so there's a character who there's a good character is linked with a bad character. They're kind of foils with one another, like two brothers, and one is a villain and one is a good guy, is a hero. And so we often see those kind of Gothic doubles. these can be violent stories. They often are. They often include violent acts or deaths, and so blood and pain and cruelty, mad or insane characters. Uncanny, the sense of the uncanny, where there's an odd kind of a shift in tone, or something unusual happens in the middle of a very normal day or a very normal occurrence. That's what we call that, the uncanny, that sense that something is a little off or something doesn't feel quite right. Oops. So the purpose of the Gothic story is to evoke terror versus horror. And what I would say, there'll be a sense of gloom, often used to teach a kind of a message. Think of, for example, how monster stories might have been used, to get you to stay in bed at night, right? If you don't stay in bed when you're a kid, if you get out of bed, the monster under the bed will get you. So that's a way of keeping kids. Or you don't go into the attic because the ghost in the attic will get you, right? So sometimes there's a teaching message. But terror versus horror, I want you to think a little bit more about for just a minute, right? Horror is often, appallingly unrealistic. It's grotesque. It's hideous. Think of something like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, right? Really violent, really bloody. That evokes horror. Terror plays on your imagination. Terror is rooted in suspense and imagination. What might happen? That creeping sense of dread. That's what Gothic literature is really banking on. So again, these are some more of the Gothic conventions that you're likely to see: family secrets, ghosts, demons, curses you often see, spirits, gloomy settings, isolated settings. These are all part of this tradition. And a few more, the damsel in distress. So think of the Twilight movies. I can't think of a better example, frankly. Bella is always having to be rescued by her vampire buddies, right? Secret passageways, mysterious rooms that are closed off that nobody's allowed to go in. These ancestral curses, a family that over the centuries has continued to pay for something that their ancestors did. Graveyards, ruined castles, trance-like states. If you want to get a great idea of a show that embodies all of this, watch an episode or two of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and you've got it. Metonymy, this is an important one to think about. So it's a kind of metaphor in which something, is used to stand for something else. It's a kind of a shorthand. And you'll see what I mean when you look at some examples. So, for example, what are some of these metonymies that suggest danger or the supernatural, right? Rain, storms, wind, doors that you can hear creaking or squeaking, right? A light where there's not supposed to be one in an abandoned room, footsteps mysteriously approaching, the baying of dogs, crazy laughter, gusts of wind blowing out lights, all of the eerie sounds, all of these have become conventions or metonymies of Gothic literature. And so when we see these or hear them, we recognize, that danger is nigh, right? Or something supernatural is going on. Setting is very influential. The castle, the abbey, the isolated landscape, the ruined building. Think about if you've watched Stranger Things. They've done a great job with using setting. The abandoned laboratory, so creepy, very creepy, right? Any abandoned building. The basic plot structure tends to take place at night or in a dark environment. You may be going up a mountain high staircase or into a cave or an underground chamber or a labyrinth or a secret passage. There's physical decay, images of death, ghosts, family curses, blood and gore, and so on. And these are probably some Gothic writers that you are familiar with. Some very recent. All right, so that's our discussion of Gothic literature. As you get ready to write for the first time, I want you to be thinking as well about the kind of writing that you're going to be doing. This first essay and most of the essays that you're going to be doing will be literary or textual analyses. So think about how you do a textual analysis. And we will talk a little bit more. I'm going to put up some information on the textual analysis and how to write one. And we will talk more about the textual analysis as we get closer to that first essay. And I will talk to you later.